3 minutes. That's all it took to send shockwaves through the most guarded institution in the world. A sealed directive, cold, precise, and unmistakably final, was issued from within palace walls. No warning. No negotiation. And at the center of it all, a single word: Queen. What happened in that moment didn't just challenge authority, it rewrote it. And the most unsettling part? It came from someone no one expected to act this boldly. Yet. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It didn't arrive with noise. There were no raised voices echoing through corridors, no dramatic confrontations spilling into public view. Instead, it appeared quietly circulated through internal channels, stamped with a level of authority that left no room for interpretation. A directive, simple in structure but devastating in implication, instructing that the title Queen was no longer to be used in any official documentation when referring to Camilla. Not reconsidered. Not reviewed. Removed. The kind of decision that doesn't just adjust protocol, it redraws the hierarchy itself. At first there was hesitation. Palace staff, trained to respond instantly, found themselves frozen in an unfamiliar uncertainty. Some reread the document, searching for nuance, for any sign that this might be temporary or conditional. Others moved quickly, almost instinctively, updating drafts, retracting language, erasing a title that had only recently been cemented into formal use. But beneath the efficiency, something else spread: confusion mixed with unease. Because this wasn't just about wording, it was about what that wording represented. The tone of the order made everything unmistakably clear. It wasn't framed as a suggestion or an evolving policy. It was final, direct, unapologetic. The kind of language that signals not just authority, but intent. And that intent carried weight: heavy, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Those who read it closely understood something immediately. This had not been decided overnight. The precision, the timing, the absence of hesitation, it all pointed to something far more calculated. A decision that had been forming quietly, out of sight, long before it ever reached paper. Behind closed doors, reactions were carefully contained, but they were impossible to hide entirely. Disbelief surfaced first, subtle but present in the way conversations paused mid-sentence. Then came tension, creeping into discussions that suddenly felt guarded, measured. And beneath it all, a quiet panic, because if a title as significant as Queen could be removed with a single directive, then what did that say about everything else? What did it mean for the stability of roles that had always seemed untouchable? Because the title itself was never just ceremonial. It carried history, legitimacy, and a deeply emotional weight tied to identity and recognition. To strip it away, even within the confines of official documents, was to send a message that reached far beyond paperwork. It suggested a shift not just in language, but in power. And power, within the monarchy, is never altered lightly. Almost immediately, whispers began to form, not public, not yet, but persistent enough to matter. This wasn't procedural. It wasn't administrative. It felt targeted, intentional, personal. The kind of move that doesn't just enforce structure but reveals something deeper, something unresolved. And as those whispers grew, so did a single unsettling question. Why now? Because orders like this don't emerge in isolation. They are the result of pressure, of tension building beneath the surface, until it can no longer remain contained. And in this case, that pressure had been building quietly, hidden behind composed appearances and carefully managed narratives. What looked like stability on the outside had, for some time, been anything but. But orders like this don't come out of nowhere. And to understand the magnitude of this moment, we need to go back to where the fractures first began. Before the title, before the crown, there was resistance. Quiet at first. Then louder. Camilla's rise was never a smooth ascent, it was a negotiation with history, perception, and deeply buried resentment. The public saw acceptance, but inside palace walls, something else lingered, something unresolved. And as time passed, that quiet resistance didn't fade, it evolved. Because some titles are worn, and others are merely tolerated. Long before the directive that would shake everything, there was a tension that refused to disappear. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the carefully chosen words that never quite said enough, and in the subtle distance that could not be explained publicly. Camilla's recognition as queen was presented as a natural progression, a moment of unity, a sign that the past had finally been reconciled with the present. But beneath that carefully maintained narrative, acceptance felt incomplete, fragile, almost conditional. Her path to that title was never defined by certainty. It was shaped by negotiation, by compromise, by a slow and deliberate effort to reshape perception. Every step forward came with an unspoken cost, as if each layer of recognition required something to be quietly set aside. And even when the title was finally acknowledged, it did not arrive with universal conviction. Instead, it carried with it the weight of everything that had come before, memories that had not faded, associations that had not been fully resolved, and emotions that remained just beneath the surface. Inside royal circles, the divide was never loud, but it was unmistakable. Some saw the title as a necessary evolution, a way to stabilize the institution and move forward. Others viewed it differently, not as a resolution, but as a concession. A decision made not out of unanimous belief, but out of necessity. And that difference in perspective created a quiet imbalance, one that never fully settled, even as outward appearances suggested otherwise. Because titles in this world are not just about position, they are about meaning. And the meaning attached to queen carried a legacy that could not simply be reassigned without consequence. It represented continuity, but also history. Authority, but also memory. And for some, those memories did not align with the narrative being presented. That disconnect, subtle as it was, began to shape how the title was perceived, not openly challenged, but never entirely embraced. Through all of this, one figure remained notably silent: William. His restraint was consistent, almost calculated. He did not publicly question, did not openly resist, but his silence carried its own weight. Because in a system where every word is measured, silence becomes a statement of its own. And over time, that silence began to feel less like neutrality and more like observation and awareness of something that had not yet been addressed. There were moments, brief but telling, where acceptance seemed almost rehearsed. Gestures that appeared aligned, yet lacked the depth that would make them feel genuine. Interactions that, while respectful, carried an undercurrent of distance. Nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to directly, but enough to suggest that beneath the surface, not everything had settled as cleanly as it appeared. And as time moved forward, that underlying tension did not disappear. It evolved. It adapted. It found new ways to exist without being fully acknowledged. The title remained, the structure held, but something about it all felt unresolved, as if the foundation itself had never been fully secured. And in an institution built on tradition and certainty, even the smallest instability has a way of growing. Because when a title is not fully accepted, it becomes something else entirely. Not a symbol of unity, but a reminder of division that has yet to be addressed. And that quiet, persistent tension, the kind that lingers without resolution, has a way of shaping decisions long before they are ever made visible. And while the world believed the dust had settled behind palace doors, a very different conversation was quietly unfolding. He never raised his voice, never made a scene, but silence, when used correctly, can be more powerful than any declaration. For months, perhaps longer, William watched, listened, and waited. Every move calculated, every reaction measured. Because when he finally acted, it wouldn't be emotional, it would be decisive. And what he was preparing to do would shift the balance of power in a way no one saw coming. What made his silence so unsettling was not its absence of sound, but its presence of intent. While others navigated the delicate balance of appearances, William remained composed, almost distant, as if he were studying something others could not yet see. He understood the system not just as it was presented, but as it functioned beneath the surface, where influence moved quietly, and decisions were shaped long before they were announced. And in that space, he began to form a perspective that did not entirely align with what had been accepted. Tradition had always been the monarchy's shield, its justification, its unspoken rulebook. But for William, tradition was no longer untouchable. It was something to be examined, questioned, even redefined if necessary. That shift did not happen overnight. It grew slowly, shaped by observation, by the realization that some traditions preserved stability, while others quietly carried unresolved tensions forward. And the title of queen, in this context, became more than a formality. It became a symbol of everything that had been left unsettled. Those closest to him began to notice the change, though few could fully interpret it. Advisors, each with their own understanding of risk and consequence, found themselves divided. Some urged caution, warning that any disruption to established roles could create instability that might spiral beyond control. Others, more aligned with William's evolving vision, saw an opportunity, a chance to reshape the monarchy into something more defined, more intentional, less burdened by compromises of the past. But even among them there was uncertainty, because no one could predict how far he was willing to go. And beneath those strategic discussions, something more personal lingered. The tension surrounding Camilla's title was never openly addressed, but it was impossible to ignore. It existed in the background of every decision, every interaction, like a question that had been deliberately left unanswered. William never confronted it directly, but his awareness of it was clear. Not through words, but through the way he carried himself, measured, controlled, but increasingly resolute. He understood the weight of legacy better than most. Not just the power it carried, but the expectations it imposed. The monarchy was not simply an institution, it was a narrative, one that had been shaped over generations. And altering that narrative required more than authority, it required precision. A single misstep could fracture the very stability he sought to protect. That was why he waited, why he observed, why he allowed the tension to exist long enough to understand its full impact. Because for William, this was never about reacting, it was about timing. Emotion could cloud judgment, but timing could redefine outcomes. He needed the moment to be right, the circumstances aligned in a way that would not just justify the decision, but make it undeniable. And as that moment approached, his silence became heavier, more deliberate, as if he were preparing for something that could not be undone once set in motion. Those around him could sense it, even if they couldn't name it. A shift in focus, a growing certainty, the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided what needed to be done, even if he had not yet acted. And that certainty carried a kind of tension of its own, because when someone moves with that level of precision, it means the decision is no longer a possibility. It's inevitable. And when inevitability finally meets action, it rarely announces itself with spectacle. It doesn't need to. Its power lies in its simplicity, in the clarity of its execution. And for William, the moment he had been preparing for would not come with confrontation or declaration. It would come in a form far more controlled, far more precise, and far more difficult to challenge. And when the moment finally came, it didn't arrive with drama, it arrived with a document. No speeches, no announcements, just ink on paper and power behind every word. The document was brief, but its implications were seismic. It didn't ask, it didn't suggest, it declared. And within seconds of being read, everything changed. Titles, authority, perception rewritten in a single stroke. But what made it truly shocking wasn't just what it said. It was who had the authority to say it. It began with language so precise it felt almost surgical. There were no unnecessary explanations, no emotional framing, no attempt to soften the impact. Every sentence was constructed to eliminate ambiguity, to ensure that the message could not be diluted or reinterpreted. The directive did not debate the title queen, it removed it. Cleanly. Completely. And in doing so, it redefined not just how Camilla would be addressed in official documents, but how authority itself would now be exercised within the institution. What made the wording so powerful was its finality. There were no clauses suggesting review, no indication that this was temporary or conditional. It was written as a conclusion, not a proposal. A decision that had already been made, now simply being enforced. And that distinction mattered. Because within a system built on tradition and gradual change, this kind of decisiveness was rare, almost unprecedented. It signaled a shift away from negotiation and toward control. The effects were immediate. Documents in progress were halted mid-preparation. Language revised in real time. Communication channels flooded with urgent clarifications. Staff moved quickly, but beneath the efficiency was something far less controlled. Uncertainty. Because while the directive itself was clear, its implications were not. Removing a title from official use was not a minor adjustment, it was a structural change, one that required immediate compliance, but raised questions no one was prepared to answer. And those questions began to surface almost instantly. Quiet at first, exchanged in low voices, carefully phrased to avoid overstepping. How far did this authority extend? Was this limited to documentation, or did it signal something broader? Could a title so publicly recognized be redefined internally without consequence? No one had clear answers, and that lack of clarity only intensified the tension. Because in a system where hierarchy is everything, uncertainty is destabilizing. What made it even more unsettling was the realization that this wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a gesture meant to send a message without real impact. It was enforceable, immediate, binding. The kind of directive that doesn't just suggest change, it demands it. And that demand carried weight, not just because of what it altered, but because of what it revealed. Authority was being exercised in a way that bypassed expectation, that challenged the assumption of how decisions at this level were supposed to be made. And at the center of it all was a question that no one could ignore for long. How? How had William positioned himself to issue something of this magnitude? The monarchy operates within a framework that is both rigid and complex, where power is shared, balanced, often constrained by precedent. Yet this directive moved through that framework without resistance, as if the path had already been cleared long before it was ever written. That realization brought with it a deeper unease because it suggested preparation, intention, and a level of strategic positioning that had gone largely unnoticed. The timing only added to the impact. It wasn't rushed, but it wasn't delayed either. It arrived at a moment that felt deliberate, as if chosen with care to maximize its effect while minimizing immediate opposition. There was no buildup, no warning signs that could have softened its arrival. Just a sudden shift executed with precision, leaving no space for adjustment before it took hold. And as the palace worked to absorb the shock, to recalibrate systems and language around this new reality, one absence became impossible to ignore. No response, no acknowledgement, no visible reaction from the one person most directly affected. And in an environment where silence often speaks louder than words, that absence carried a weight of its own, heavy, deliberate, and filled with possibilities no one could yet define. But while the palace scrambled to adjust, one person hadn't yet responded, and her silence was louder than anything else. No immediate statement, no visible reaction, just silence. But inside that silence, a storm was building. Because this wasn't just about a title, it was about identity, recognition, and years of navigating an institution that never fully embraced her. And now, in a single move, that fragile standing had been shaken. The question wasn't whether she would respond, but how and what it would cost. For Camilla, the absence of words was not emptiness, it was calculation wrapped in restraint. She had spent years mastering that balance, learning when to speak and, more importantly, when not to. Because within the monarchy, reaction is never just personal, it becomes narrative. And narrative, once shaped, is nearly impossible to reclaim. So she remained still, outwardly composed, even as the implications of the directive settled in with quiet force. The title that had once symbolized a hard-won position was now being quietly erased from the very documents that defined legitimacy. But this wasn't the first time she had faced resistance. Her entire journey had been marked by it. From the beginning, acceptance had never been freely given, it had been negotiated, earned in fragments, often under scrutiny that never fully disappeared. She had adapted, endured, reshaped herself within a system that did not easily bend. And through that process, she had built something fragile but real, a place that, while contested, had become hers. And now, that place felt uncertain again. Because the removal of the title was not just administrative, it was deeply personal. It questioned not just her position, but the recognition of everything that had led her there. Years of quiet persistence, of navigating public perception while managing private realities, suddenly reframed by a single decision. and the silence she maintained began to carry a different weight, not just composure, but conflict. Those closest to her understood the stakes immediately. Advice came carefully, measured, shaped by the understanding that any response could shift the situation further. Some urged patience, warning that reacting too quickly could validate the decision rather than challenge it. Others hinted at the need for subtle resistance, not confrontation, but presence. A way to assert without escalating. But even among her closest allies, there was no clear path forward. Because this was not a situation with precedent. It was uncharted, and that made every possible move uncertain. And beneath the strategy, the emotional toll remained. The contrast between public perception and private reality had always been a part of her experience, but now it felt sharper, more defined. To the outside world, the absence of a title might seem procedural, even insignificant. But within the institution, it carried meaning that could not be dismissed. It altered how she would be referenced, how she would be recorded, how she would exist within the official structure. And that kind of shift is never neutral, it changes how history itself is written. The tension between dignity and defiance became impossible to ignore. To remain silent was to maintain control, to avoid feeding a narrative that might spiral beyond her influence. But silence also risked being interpreted as acceptance. And acceptance, in this context, could solidify a decision that had already begun to reshape her standing. It was a delicate balance, one that required not just patience but precision. Because the question was no longer just about the directive itself, it was about what came next. Would she challenge it, directly or indirectly? Would she allow it to stand, choosing stability over confrontation? Or would she find a way to respond that reasserted her position without breaking the fragile equilibrium that still held the institution together? And as that question lingered, unresolved but impossible to ignore, it became clear that this was no longer contained to a single decision or a single individual. The directive had done more than alter a title, it had sent a message. A signal that power was shifting, that boundaries were being redrawn. And signals like that are never received in isolation. But this wasn't just a personal battle, it was a signal. And others inside the palace were already choosing sides. Loyalty inside the palace has always been complicated, but never like this. Lines were drawn not publicly, but unmistakably. Conversations turned guarded. Alliances shifted. And for the first time in years, the illusion of unity began to crack. Because this decision didn't just challenge one person, it forced everyone to choose where they stood and what they were willing to risk. What made the shift so unsettling was how quietly it happened. There were no declarations of allegiance, no visible fractures that the public could immediately recognize. Instead, it unfolded in the subtle ways that only those inside could truly feel. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. Words were chosen with care, sometimes avoided altogether. And in those silences, positions began to take shape. Not openly, not yet, but clearly enough to be understood. Some aligned themselves with William's decision, not out of impulse, but out of belief that the monarchy needed clarity, even if that clarity came at a cost. They saw the directive as a necessary correction, a way to resolve tensions that had been allowed to linger for too long. To them, this was not disruption, it was direction. A decisive step toward redefining authority in a way that left no room for ambiguity. But even within that support, there was an awareness of risk. Because decisions of this magnitude do not exist in isolation, they ripple outward, affecting everything they touch. Others, however, viewed the situation through a different lens. To them, the directive represented something far more dangerous than a simple adjustment. It signaled instability, a break from the careful balance that had held the institution together through far more visible challenges. They understood that tradition was not just symbolic, it was structural. And altering it, especially so abruptly, could create fractures that would not easily be repaired. Their concern was not just about Camilla, but about what this precedent might allow in the future. Between these two perspectives, tension began to build, not loud, not confrontational, but persistent. Private disagreements surfaced in controlled conversations, where every statement carried weight and every response was measured. These were not arguments in the traditional sense. They were standoffs, quiet, restrained, but deeply consequential. Because within those exchanges, the future of the institution was being debated in real time, even if no final conclusions had yet been reached. The most telling change, however, was not in what was said, but in what was no longer certain. Relationships that had once operated with an unspoken understanding began to shift. Trust, once assumed, now required validation. Familiar dynamics felt less stable, as if the foundation beneath them had subtly moved. And in an environment where stability is everything, even the smallest shift can feel significant. At the center of it all was a growing realization that this was not a contained issue. It was not limited to a single title or a single decision. It was a reflection of something larger, a tension between what the monarchy had always been and what it was now becoming. Tradition and authority, once aligned, were beginning to diverge, and that divergence created uncertainty that no one could fully control. Because once a line is drawn, even quietly, it changes how everything is perceived. Decisions are no longer neutral, they are interpreted. Actions are no longer isolated, they are connected. And within that environment, every move carries a weight that extends far beyond its immediate impact. What made this moment particularly volatile was the absence of resolution. There was no clear outcome, no agreement that could restore a sense of unity. Instead, there was only movement, slow, deliberate, and increasingly difficult to predict. And as that movement continued, the understanding began to settle in that this conflict was not temporary. It was transformative. Because when an institution built on continuity begins to question itself from within, the effects are never minor. They reshape expectations, redefine roles, and challenge the very structure that holds everything together. And for those inside the palace, that realization was impossible to ignore. This was no longer about managing perception, it was about navigating a shift that could alter the monarchy's future in ways no one had fully anticipated. And as that future began to take shape, one thing became clear. The divide was no longer contained within palace walls. The subtle changes, the quiet tensions, the unspoken alignments, they were starting to surface in ways that could not be easily hidden. And as the divide deepened, the outside world began to notice something was very wrong. At first, it was just a whisper, a subtle change in language, a missing title. But then people started asking questions. And once those questions surfaced, they spread rapidly. Because the public doesn't ignore shifts like this, they amplify them. And suddenly, what was meant to remain contained within palace walls was becoming something far bigger and far more uncontrollable. It began with small details almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. A document released without the expected wording. A formal mention that felt slightly altered, incomplete in a way that couldn't be immediately explained. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A minor oversight. A clerical inconsistency. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, and once people began to notice that the omission was repeating, the questions became unavoidable. Why was the title missing? Was it intentional? And if it was, who had made that decision? The public, long accustomed to reading between the lines of royal communication, didn't need much time to connect the dots. Conversations started quietly, in corners of discussion where speculation thrives. But silence only fueled curiosity, and curiosity quickly turned into momentum. Because in a world where every word from the monarchy is carefully chosen, the absence of a word can feel even more deliberate. Media attention followed almost immediately, drawn not by official confirmation, but by the growing tension between what was being said and what was no longer being said. Analysts dissected language, comparing past statements to present ones, searching for meaning in the smallest changes. And with every comparison, the narrative became harder to contain. This wasn't a mistake. It was a shift. And once that idea took hold, everything else began to change. Social discourse intensified, pulling the issue out of quiet observation and into open debate. People weren't just noticing, they were interpreting. Some saw it as a bold move, a necessary correction that hinted at deeper changes within the monarchy. Others viewed it as a sign of instability, a crack in the carefully maintained image of unity. And between those perspectives, the conversation grew louder, more divided, more emotionally charged. Because this wasn't just about a title anymore. It had become a symbol of power, of control, of something happening behind the scenes that the public could sense but not fully understand. And that uncertainty made it even more compelling. The lack of explanation didn't quiet the narrative, it expanded it. Every unanswered question created space for new interpretations, each one adding another layer to a story that was rapidly evolving beyond the palace's control. Inside the institution, the pressure was building. Maintaining a controlled narrative had always been essential, but now that control was slipping. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to be felt. The usual strategies, silence, consistency, restraint, were no longer as effective as they once had been. Because the narrative was no longer confined to official statements. It was being shaped externally, in real time, by a public that was watching closely and asking increasingly difficult questions. And with that shift came something even more challenging to manage: emotion. Supporters and critics alike began to take sides, not based on confirmed information, but on perception. Some defended the decision, framing it as a sign of necessary evolution. Others questioned it, seeing it as a disruption that risked undermining the very stability the monarchy depended on. And as those perspectives clashed, the issue transformed from a quiet internal adjustment into a visible divide. The demand for clarity grew stronger with every passing moment. Not just curiosity, but expectation. Because once the public becomes aware of a shift like this, silence is no longer neutral, it becomes part of the story. And the longer that silence continues, the more meaning it begins to carry. What had started as a subtle omission was now impossible to ignore. A missing word had turned into a defining question, and that question was no longer confined to speculation. It was pressing, insistent, and growing louder by the second. But as the noise grew louder, one final question remained. Was this the end of a title, or the beginning of something far more disruptive? This was never just about a title. It was about control, direction, and the future of an institution built on tradition. Because when one word is removed, it creates space for something else to take its place. And what's emerging now isn't just a shift, it's a transformation. The kind that doesn't happen overnight, but once it begins, it cannot be reversed. What began as a single directive now carries implications far beyond its original intent. Because within the monarchy, titles are not simply labels, they are anchors. They define structure, reinforce hierarchy, and preserve continuity across generations. To alter one, especially one as significant as Queen, is to loosen something much deeper. It raises a question that cannot be easily contained. If a title can be redefined, then what else within this system is no longer fixed? For William, this moment appears to be more than a reaction, it feels like direction. A deliberate step toward reshaping the monarchy into something more controlled, more intentional, perhaps even more streamlined. His approach suggests a shift away from inherited assumptions toward a model where authority is actively asserted rather than passively maintained. And while that may signal strength, it also introduces a new kind of uncertainty. Because once authority begins to redefine tradition, it changes the rules that once seemed unchangeable. But transformation, especially within an institution built on continuity, is never without consequence. Every adjustment creates tension between what was and what is becoming. And in this case, that tension is particularly sharp. Because tradition is not just ceremonial, it is stabilizing. It provides predictability in a system where perception is everything. To disrupt that predictability, even with precision, risks creating fractures that may not be immediately visible, but are deeply felt. There is also the weight of precedent. Decisions like this do not exist in isolation, they set a standard. They establish what is possible. And once something becomes possible, it becomes repeatable. That realization carries a quiet but powerful implication. This may not be the last time a long-standing element of the monarchy is reconsidered. It may in fact be the beginning of a pattern. And that is where the unease begins to grow. Because if this decision was calculated, if it was part of a broader vision rather than a singular act, then it suggests something far more significant is already in motion. Not a sudden overhaul, but a gradual reshaping. The kind that unfolds step by step, each move building on the last, until the final outcome becomes clear only when it is too late to reverse it. And in that context, the removal of a title feels less like an endpoint and more like an opening move. For those watching closely, The question is no longer just about what has already happened, but about what might follow. Will other titles be reconsidered? Will roles be redefined? Will the balance between tradition and authority continue to shift in ways that challenge long-standing expectations? These are not abstract concerns, they are immediate, pressing, and impossible to ignore. At the same time, there is an emotional dimension that cannot be separated from the structural one. Breaking precedent is not just a procedural act, it carries symbolic weight. It reshapes how individuals within the institution are seen, how their positions are validated, and how their contributions are remembered. And when that symbolism is altered, it affects more than perception, it affects identity. What makes this moment particularly powerful is its uncertainty. There is no clear resolution, no definitive statement that explains where this is all leading. Only a growing sense that something fundamental is shifting, and that the full extent of that shift has not yet been revealed. And that uncertainty creates tension that lingers, that builds, that refuses to settle. Because in the end, this was never just about removing a word from a document. It was about redefining what that word represented, and in doing so, redefining the structure around it. And once that process begins, it does not simply stop. It evolves, it expands, it reshapes everything it touches. Because if one title can disappear overnight, what else might already be on the verge of being rewritten? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.